The medical report in my hand was a cold, hard death sentence to my legacy. It read, Huang Xiorian, infertile. I sat in the shadows of the hospital room, a ghost in my own life, when my twin brother Seokrim burst in. He was beaming, cradling a newborn baby he claimed was my heir. I didn't call him a liar. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I watched the hidden security feed as he went into the dressing room and meticulously painted a fake, jagged scar onto his smooth cheek, practicing my aggressive snarl in the mirror. Seokrim thought he was stealing my multi-billion-dollar empire. He didn't realize he was actually volunteering to be my human shield. I stood up, pulled my heavy gold signet ring from my finger, and pressed it into Seokrim's hand. "The throne is yours, brother," I whispered. He smirked, thinking he'd finally outsmarted me. But as I walked out the back door into the rainy night, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Seokrim didn't know that my company was $100 million in debt. He didn't know that 3 rival gangs had hired hitmen to kill the man with the scar before dawn. He wanted my crown so badly that he didn't check to see if it was a gift or a target. I'm going to let him play the king, and I'm going to watch from the shadows as the kingdom I built crushes him to death. The walls of the safe house were peeling, a stark contrast to the mahogany-paneled office Xiorian had occupied for a decade. He sat in the flickering blue light of a dozen monitors, his eyes fixed on a man wearing his face. On the center screen, Seokrim adjusted his tie for the 10th time. He looked perfect, too perfect. His hair was slicked back without a single strand out of place, and the fake scar on his cheek was a masterpiece of silicone and spirit gum. But as Seokrim stepped into the boardroom of the Huang Group, the cameras captured the subtle tremor in his hands that the capos were sure to notice. Xiorian leaned back, sipping cold coffee, and watched the shark circle. These weren't just businessmen. They were underworld leaders, men who had buried bodies before they learned to balance ledgers. They sat around the long table, their eyes cold and expectant. They were waiting for their boss, the man who ruled with an iron fist and a blood-stained reputation. The merger with the Dragon Syndicate is a risk. One of the elders, Mr. Park, growled, slamming a folder onto the table. "We need a leader who can dominate them, Xiorian, not a diplomat." Seokrim flinched. It was subtle, a slight blink of the eyes, but to these men, it was the scent of blood in the water. Instead of slamming his fist down or offering a lethal threat, Seokrim leaned forward with a polite, nervous smile. "I believe we can find a middle ground," Seokrim said, his voice lacking the gravel and authority Xiorian had spent years forging. "A peaceful transition is better for the stock price." A heavy silence filled the room. Xiorian watched in the dark room, a cynical smile touching his lips. Stock prices? These men didn't care about dividends. They cared about territory and respect. Mr. Park leaned in, his gaze piercing Seokrim's disguise. "Since when did you start caring about peace? You look like Xiorian, but you talk like a choir boy." Seokrim's confident smirk faltered. He began to sweat, the moisture threatening to loosen the adhesive on his fake scar. He was drowning in a sea of monsters, and he didn't even know how to swim. He reached for the gold signet ring, twisting it nervously, a habit Xiorian never had. The monitors showed the elders exchanging glances of pure contempt. The trap was working. Seokrim wanted a crown, but he had no idea that the weight of it would break his neck. Xiorian was a ghost in the machine, the silent witness to his own brother's slow execution. Seokrim was the face of the empire now, which meant when the daggers finally came out, he would be the one to feel the cold steel. Xiorian settled deeper into shadows, waiting for the next move. The heavy gold watch on Seokrim's wrist felt like a trophy, its diamond-encrusted face catching the light of the penthouse suite. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at price tags or worrying about the next month's rent. He threw a stack of high-denomination chips onto the velvet baccarat table, a glass of vintage cognac in his other hand. Around him, the air smelled of expensive tobacco and the desperate sweat of men who had less than him. Seokrim laughed, a loud, boastful sound that echoed to the private club, a sound Xiorian would never have made. From a corner of the room, Chun, the organization's most trusted advisor and Xiorian's shadow for 15 years, watched with narrowed eyes. He stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that cut through the noise of the casino. "Boss, You spent $6 million in 2 nights. This isn't just about the money. It's about the attention. The Dragon Syndicate is watching our accounts. This level of noise makes us a target. C.O. Krim didn't even look up from his cards. He waved a dismissive hand, the signet ring flashing arrogantly. It's my money, Chin. I've spent 20 years building this empire. If I want to buy a fleet of Italian sports cars and stay in this suite for a month, I will. Stop acting like my accountant and start acting like my guard. Chen's jaw tightened. The disrespect was a physical blow. The real Seorian valued Chen's counsel above all else. They were a partnership built on blood and silence. The council is asking why you missed a shipment meeting this morning, Chen persisted, his voice dropping to a whisper. They are starting to talk, Seorian. They say you've grown soft. They say you're acting like a lottery winner instead of king. C.O. Krim slammed his glass down, the amber liquid splashing onto the table. Let them talk. I am the boss. If they have a problem, they can come to me. He turned back to the dealer, shouting for another round of cards. He was drunk on the power, blinded by the glitter of a life he hadn't earned. He truly believed he was safe, nestled in the heart of the fortress his brother had built. Miles away, in the dim glow of the safe house, Seorian watched the feed of the penthouse security cameras. He saw the fury in Chen's eyes and the reckless glint in Seokrim's gaze. The first crack had appeared. Seokrim was so busy enjoying the taste of luxury that he couldn't smell the poison hidden in the wine. He was making himself an enemy of his own inner circle, and Seorian knew that once the men inside the house turned on the master, the walls would come tumbling down. Seorian adjusted the volume on the monitor, a cold, patient smile playing across his scarred face. The bait was being swallowed. The fragrance of jasmine and expensive perfume filled the private garden as Jang Mi sat across from a man she believed was the love of her life. She watched Seokrim through narrowed eyes, her tea cooling untouched on the table. For years, she had known Seorian as a man of few words, a man whose presence felt like a cold blade against the neck. But the man sitting here was different. He was smiling too much, and his eyes lacked the haunted, calculating depth she had grown to fear and crave. You've been different lately, Seorian, Jamie murmured, her voice soft but sharp. The man who used to despise these gardens is suddenly inviting me for tea. Since when did you become so soft? Seokrim laughed, reaching across the table to touch her hand. His skin was warm, lacking the permanent chill that usually clung to his brother. A man can change. Jang Mi, seeing how close I came to losing everything made me realize that you're the only thing that matters. I want us to be happy, away from the blood and the business. Jang Mi didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't relax either. The real Seorian spoke of power, loyalty, and survival of the Huang name. He never spoke of happiness. As the afternoon sun shifted, a beam of harsh light hit Seokrim's face. Jang Mi froze. Near the edge of his jaw, the jagged scar she knew so well seemed to lose its texture. In the heat and the light, the edges of the wound looked slick, almost as if it were melting into his skin. Your scar, she whispered, leaning in closer. It looks different today. Did the doctor give you a new ointment? Seokrim quickly pulled back, his hand flying to his face to cover the area. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine panic that he tried to bury under a cough. It's the sunlight. It plays tricks on the eyes. I've been exhausted with the merger. That's all. He stood up abruptly, signaling the end of the meeting. Jang Mi watched him walk away, noticing how his gait was bouncy and hurried, lacking the heavy, rhythmic stride of a true predator. She reached into her bag and pulled out a silk handkerchief, looking at the faint smudge of beige foundation she had noticed on the rim of his teacup. Miles away, Seorian watched the high-definition feed from the garden. He saw Jang Mi's suspicion and his brother's clumsy retreat. The woman who knew him best was starting to see the cracks in the porcelain mask. Seorian felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, jealousy, but he pushed it down. The game was more important than the girl. If Seokrim wanted to play the lover, he would have to learn that in this world, love was the fastest way to get a knife in the back. Seorian turned off the screen, the darkness of the safe house swallowing him whole. Rain lashed against the windows of the abandoned warehouse, a rhythmic drumming that masked the sound of breathing. Seokrim paced the concrete floor, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking nervously. He was here to meet a high-level informant, but he looked less like a feared Mafia boss and more like a cornered animal. The fake scar on his face seemed to itch under pressure, and his eyes darted toward every shadow. Above him, tucked away in the rusted steel rafters, Ciorian lay perfectly still. He was dressed in matte black, a ghost among the iron beams. Through the thermal scope of his suppressed rifle, he watched the scene unfold. He didn't focus on his brother. He focused on the surrounding rooftops. He knew this meeting was a setup. The Dragon Syndicate didn't want a merger. They wanted a funeral. 2 red laser dots appeared on Siakrim's chest, dancing across his silk tie. The impostor didn't even notice. He was too busy checking his gold watch, oblivious to the fact that he was seconds away from having his skull opened. Ciorian adjusted his grip on the rifle, his breathing slowing to a crawl. He didn't love his brother, but he couldn't let him die. Not yet. If Siakrim died now, the debt trap wouldn't spring, and the real traitors would stay hidden. A sniper on the north ledge squeezed his trigger. Ciorian was faster. A soft foot echoed in the rafters, and the north sniper slumped over, his rifle clattering onto the bricks. Before the second assassin could react, Ciorian shifted his aim and fired again. The second red vanished from Siakrim's chest as the second shooter fell into the darkness below. Siakrim jumped at the sound of the body hitting the pavement outside. "Who's there?" he screamed, pulling a chrome pistol from his waistband with shaking hands. He fired blindly into the dark, hitting nothing but empty crates. He looked small, pathetic, and completely out of his league. He had no idea that his life had been saved by the very man he had tried to erase. Ciorian watched through the scope as Siakrim scrambled back into his armored limousine, shouting for his driver to go. The car sped away, tires screeching against the wet asphalt. Ciorian remained in the rafters for a long time, the cold steel of the rifle pressed against his cheek. He had saved Siakrim today, but it wasn't an act of mercy. It was an investment. The boss needed to stay alive long enough to sign the papers that would ruin him forever. Ciorian stood up, vanished into the shadows of the warehouse, and prepared for the next stage of the long game. The bait was still on the hook. The safe house air was thick with the smell of old paper and copper, but Ciorian didn't mind the grime. His focus was entirely on the digital folder he was about to release into Siakrim's private server. The document was titled Project Phoenix. To a greedy man like Siakrim, it looked like the ultimate treasure, a massive offshore investment in gold mines that promised to triple the family's fortune in weeks. In reality, the contract was a masterpiece of legal deception. Hidden in the fine print was a clause that made the signer personally liable for $100 million in existing underworld debts. Ciorian clicked the send button and leaned back, watching the monitor that looked into the main office. It didn't take long. Siakrim sat at a mahogany desk, his eyes widening as he opened the file. He began to scroll, his face lighting up with the kind of hunger only a thief can feel. He didn't call the lawyers. He didn't ask Chun for advice. He saw the numbers and the promise of escaping the dirty side of the business forever. To Siakrim, this wasn't just money. It was his ticket to being a legitimate billionaire who no longer needed to hide behind a fake scar. Ciorian watched as Siakrim picked up a fountain pen. The gold nib hovered over the signature line. "Do it," Ciorian whispered to the empty room, his voice a low rasp. "Sign your name. Claim your kingdom." On the screen, Siakrim hesitated for only a second before scrawling the name Huang Ciorian across the bottom of the page. He pressed his thumb onto the biometric ink pad, sealing the deal with the very fingerprints that Ciorian had already linked to the debt accounts. Siakrim leaned back in the chair, a triumphant smirk crossing his face. He believed he had just secured his future. He thought he was finally standing on equal ground with his brother. Ciorian let out a slow, cold breath. The trap had snapped shut. By signing that paper, Siakrim hadn't just taken the money. He had taken the handcuffs. He had officially assumed responsibility for every cent the organization owed to the most dangerous banks in the world. The clean brother was now the most indebted man in the country. Ciorian began to pack his small bag. He didn't need to watch the cameras as much anymore. The clock was ticking, and soon the collectors would come for the man who thought he could buy his way out of a mafia's life. The $100 million bait had been swallowed whole, and there was no way for Seokrim to unhook himself now. The memory always smelled like wet asphalt and cold iron. 19 years ago, the world was smaller, but the shadows were just as long. Seorian and Seokrim were barely teenagers, trapped in a dead-end alleyway behind their father's warehouse. The rain was heavy, blurring the faces of the 3 rival gang members who stood between them and the exit. They weren't looking for a talk. They were looking for a message to send to the Huang family. Seokrim was shaking. He had collapsed against a pile of rusted crates, his breath coming in jagged gasps. His clean clothes were stained with mud, and his eyes were wide with a terror that paralyzed him. He didn't look for a weapon or a way out. He only looked at his brother's back. Seorian stood 2 steps in front of him, feet planted firmly on the slick ground. Even then, Seorian knew that one of them had to be the shield, so the other could stay soft. "Please," Seokrim whimpered, his voice cracking. "Give them whatever they want. Just don't let them hurt me." The leader of the thugs stepped forward, a switchblade clicking open in his hand. The steel caught the dim light of a street lamp, a silver flash in the gray rain. "The boss said the Huang boys need to learn a lesson," the man growled. He lunged, aiming the blade directly at Seokrim's throat. Seorian didn't hesitate. He didn't cry out. He threw his body into the path of the knife, shoving Seokrim deeper into the shadows. The blade didn't hit his chest. It sliced deep across his cheek, from his ear to the corner of his mouth. The pain was white-hot, a searing line that felt like liquid fire. But Seorian didn't fall. He grabbed a heavy lead pipe from the ground and swung with a primal scream, driving the attackers back into the street. When the silence returned, Seorian knelt in the dirt, his hand pressed against his face. Blood leaked through his fingers, staining the collar of his shirt. Seokrim crawled out from behind the crates, looking at his brother with a mix of relief and disgust. He didn't offer a bandage or a thank you. He just stared at the ruined flesh of Seorian's face. "You're ugly now," Seokrim whispered, his voice trembling. "They're going to look at you and see a monster." Seorian looked at his twin, the brother who had stayed clean while he bled. "Let them look," Seorian replied, his voice already turning into the cold rasp it would stay for the rest of his life. "As long as they're looking at me, they aren't looking at you." In the present day, Seorian touched the jagged ridge of that same scar. He had been a shield for 19 years, taking every hit so Seokrim could play the role of the perfect son. But the shield was gone now. He had stepped aside, and for the first time in their lives, the blade was heading straight for Seokrim, and there was no one left to catch it. The morning air in the executive suite felt heavy, saturated with the scent of expensive cologne and the underlying ozone of a brewing storm. Seokrim sat behind the desk, his fingers tracing the edges of the fake scar that felt more like a brand with every passing hour. He was beginning to like the view from the top, the way the staff bowed, and the way the city looked like a toy box from this height. But the illusion shattered when the secretary walked in, trembling as she placed a small, velvet-lined box on the mahogany surface. There was no card, only a seal of black wax. Seokrim opened the box, and his breath hitched. Resting inside was a silver masquerade mask, crafted with haunting precision. It wasn't just any mask. It was designed to cover exactly half the face, mirroring the jagged path of the scar he had painted on his own skin. The silver was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting his own panicked eyes back at him. It was a silent, elegant accusation. It was a message that said, "I see you. I know who is under the paint." He slammed the lid shut, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Who sent this?" he barked, his voice cracking, losing the deep authority he had tried so hard to fake. The secretary shook her head, stammering about a courier who had vanished before she could ask for a name. Seokrim dismissed her with a frantic wave and began to pace the room. The walls that felt like a fortress now felt like the bars of a cage. Paranoia began to leak into his mind like slow-acting venom. He looked at the security cameras in the corners of the ceiling, wondering if the glass lenses were actually eyes. Every footstep in the hallway sounded like an assassin. Every whisper from the capos in the lounge sounded like a plot to expose him. He ran to the private bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. Staring into the mirror, a small smudge of beige makeup had rubbed off on his collar, revealing a patch of smooth, unblemished skin beneath. Someone knows. Seokrim hissed his reflection, his hand shaking so violently he could barely reapply the concealer. He thought of the $100 million deal he had signed, the shadow of his brother's ghost, and the silent advisor, Chun, who always seemed to be watching him a second too long. The luxury he had craved was turning to ash in his mouth. Across the city, in the silence of the safe house, Seorian watched the feed. He saw his brother's breakdown, the way Seokrim checked behind the curtains and toward his own hair. The mask had done its job. It wasn't enough to bankrupt Seokrim or to lead him to the wolves. Seorian wanted his brother to feel the suffocating weight of the identity he had stolen. The gift was poisoned, not with chemicals, but with the truth. Seorian leaned back in his chair, the dark room feeling more like home than the penthouse ever had. The hunt was no longer in the shadows. It was inside Seokrim's head. The blue light of the monitors reflected in Seorian's eyes, cold and unwavering. He sat in the silence of the safe house, his hands steepled as he watched a live feed from a private booth in a high-end jazz club. The club belonged to the Dragon Syndicate, the very rivals who had tried to kill the boss only weeks ago. In the booth, shrouded by thick cigar smoke, sat Seokrim. Across from him was a man with a serpent tattooed on his neck, the Syndicate's primary enforcer. Seorian turned up the audio. The hidden microphone he had planted in Seokrim's gold signet ring picked up every word, every stutter, and every desperate breath. Seokrim wasn't acting like a king anymore. He was hunched over, his face pale beneath the fake scar. He looked like a man trying to buy his way out of a burning building. "I'll give you the coordinates to the northern docks," Seokrim whispered, his voice trembling as he slid a digital drive across the table, "and the access codes to the 3 main weapon vaults. It's everything you need to wipe out the Huang family's influence in one night." The Syndicate enforcer leaned forward, a slow, cruel grin spreading across his face. "And in exchange, you want a new life? A clean record?" "I want out," Seokrim hissed, his eyes darting around the room in a state of pure panic. "I want the debt gone. I want a new name and a flight to Switzerland. I'm done playing this game. My brother was a monster, but I'm not. I just want the money and the freedom." In the safe house, Seorian's jaw tightened. He had known his brother was weak, and he had known he was a thief, but this was the ultimate betrayal. Seokrim wasn't just stealing the throne. He was selling the lives of every loyal soldier who had bled for the Huang name. He was trading the blood of his family for a first-class ticket to a coward's paradise. Seorian felt a cold, familiar fire rise in his chest. The same fire he felt in that alleyway 19 years ago. Seorian hit the record button, saving the footage to multiple encrypted drives. This was the final nail in the coffin. He had allowed Seokrim to spend the money, to wear the suit, and to touch the ring. But selling the territory was a sin that the underworld never forgiven. By trying to buy a clean exit, Seokrim had just guaranteed that his end would be the messiest one possible. The enforcer took the drive and stood up, leaving Seokrim alone in the booth. Seokrim slumped back, exhaling a long sigh of relief, thinking he'd just saved himself. He didn't know that Seorian was already typing a command that would leak a small, untraceable hint of this meeting to the family elders. Seorian watched as his brother took a celebratory drink of whiskey. It was a drink of a dead man. The trap was no longer just about money. It was about blood, and the debt was about to be collected. The morning didn't bring the sun. It brought the sound of a phone that wouldn't stop screaming. Seokrim sat in the center of the penthouse, the silence of the luxury suite feeling more like a tomb. He opened his laptop, expecting to see the golden numbers of the Phoenix Project rise. Instead, the screen was a sea of flashing red. The offshore investment hadn't just failed. It had vanished. A notification popped up, cold and official. Because Seokrim had used his biometric thumbprint and the signet ring to authorize the final contracts, the hidden liability clause had activated. The $100 million debt of the Huang organization was no longer a corporate problem. It was his, personally. Every bank account under the name Huang Seorian, accounts Seokrim had worked so hard to steal, flashed a balance of zero. The heavy oak doors of the office swung open. Chen walked in, but he wasn't carrying a morning briefing. He was followed by 2 men in dark overcoats whose hands remained deep in their pockets. They didn't bow. They didn't even look at Seokrim with respect. They looked at him like a piece of meat that had already been sold. "The creditors are calling, boss," Chin said, his voice as sharp as a razor. "The high-interest lenders from Macau syndicate. They saw the default. They want their money by midnight, or they want the head of the man who signed the paper." Seokrim felt the air leave his lungs. "But the investment, it was supposed to be safe. I'm the CEO. I have rights." "You aren't a CEO anymore, Seokrim," Chin whispered, leaning over the desk until his face was inches from the fake, trembling scar. "You're a debtor. In this world, when you owe $100 million to the wrong people, you don't get a lawyer. You get a plastic sheet on a basement floor." Seokrim looked at the gold watch on his wrist. Suddenly, it didn't feel like a trophy. It felt like a shackle. He had traded his safe, boring life for this gilded cage of debt and death. He realized now that Seorian hadn't just given him an empire. He had handed him a ticking bomb and walked away. The luxury cars, the expensive suits, and the silk sheets were all just curtains hiding a gallows. From the safe house, Seorian watched the color drain from his brother's face. He saw Seokrim reach for the phone to call for help, only to realize he had no one left call. Every friend Seokrim had made was bought with money that no longer existed. The trap hadn't just sprung. It had crushed the bone. Seorian picked up a small black burner phone. It was time for the final invitation. The Grand Crystal Ballroom was a sea of velvet and gold, filled with the most dangerous men in the country. Everyone was masked, their true identities hidden behind silk and porcelain. Seokrim stood at the center of the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the weight of the $100 million debt, like a physical chain, and the eyes of the creditors felt like needles on his skin. He adjusted his silver masquerade mask, the one Seorian had sent him, trying to project the image of a king who wasn't about to lose his head. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The music died instantly, a cold silence sweeping through the crowd like a winter wind. A man stepped into the light. He was wearing the exact same midnight blue Italian suit as Seokrim. He moved with a slow, predatory rhythm that commanded the air around him. The crowd parted instinctively, men bowing before they even realized why. As the stranger reached the center of the dance floor, he stopped 10 feet away from Seokrim. Seokrim froze, his breath hitching. The man across from him wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't need one. His face was a map of cold authority, and the jagged, white scar running across his cheek was real, pulsing with the memory of the blood he had shed. It was Seorian. The underworld elite gasped, their heads turning back and forth between the two identical figures. One man had a face as smooth as glass beneath his makeup. The other looked like he had walked out of a war zone. For the first time in their lives, the two bosses stood face to face in the light of 1,000 candles. "You're late for your own funeral, brother," Seorian said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that filled the silent room. It was a voice that didn't need a microphone to be heard. Seokrim tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He reached for his gold signet ring, trying to claim the authority he had stolen. But the sight of the real Seorian made him look like a child playing dress-up. The capos and the rival bosses began to circle them, their hands moving toward their waistbands. They realized they had been following a ghost, while the real king had been watching from the dark. Seorian stepped closer, the light catching the cold fire in his eyes. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at the man who had tried to sell his soul for a clean life. "You wanted my name, Seokrim. You wanted my money and my throne. But you forgot that in this world, the crown is made of thorns." Seorian reached out and gripped Seokrim's wrist, the strength in his hand enough to crush bone. The climax had arrived, and the ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It was a courtroom, and the sentence was about to be carried out. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt like it might shatter the crystal chandeliers. Seorian didn't let go of Seokrim's wrist. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. He tossed it onto a nearby table, right in front of the Mafia elders. "The man you've been following for months is a lie," Seorian announced, his voice echoing like a gunshot. "That paper is a medical report from the night I disappeared. It shows that I, the real Seorian, have a failing heart. I am a dying man. But look at my brother. Look at how healthy he is. He's so healthy that he thought he could live forever on my name. The elders leaned in, their eyes scanning the document. Seokrim began to shake, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He tried to pull away, but Seorian's grip was like a vice. He took the throne, yes, Seorian continued, a dark smirk playing on his lips. But he also took the debt. Every contract signed in the last 3 months carries his biometric markers. He didn't just steal my life. He stole my grave. He owes $100 million to men who don't accept apologies. Seokrim finally found his voice, though it was thin and high. He's lying. Look at my face. I have the scar. I am the boss. Seorian didn't argue. He simply reached out and grabbed a glass of dark red wine from a passing waiter's tray. With a flick of his wrist, he splashed the liquid directly into Seokrim's face. The crowd gasped. Seokrim sputtered, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. But as the wine and the friction did their work, the truth began to run. The jagged, dark scar on Seokrim's cheek didn't bleed. It smeared under the harsh lights of the ballroom. The silicone peeled away in wet, brownish clumps, revealing the smooth, unblemished skin of a man who had never fought a day in his life. The boss was melting. The room erupted in a low, dangerous murmur. The capos stepped forward, their faces twisting with a fury that made Seokrim collapse to his knees. He looked up at Seorian, begging with his eyes, but he found no mercy there. "You wanted to be me, Seokrim," Seorian whispered, leaning down so only his brother could hear. "Now you get the full experience. The debt, the enemies, and the end." Seorian straightened his suit and stepped back, leaving his brother shivering on the floor, a man with a clean face and a death sentence. The truth was out, and in this world, the truth was more lethal than any bullet. The ballroom cleared with the chilling efficiency of a graveyard at midnight. The creditors didn't use handcuffs. They used heavy, gloved hands to hoist Seokrim off the floor. His screams for mercy echoed against the marble walls, a high-pitched sound that died abruptly as the heavy double doors slammed shut behind him. He was no longer a brother or a boss. To the men dragging him away, he was simply a $100 million invoice that had to be paid in blood. Seorian stood in the center of the sudden silence. The air was thick with a metallic scent of spilled wine and a lingering smoke of expensive cigars. His enemies were gone, either dead, in debt, or too terrified to speak his name. He had used his own brother as a scalpel to cut the cancer out of his empire, and the surgery was a success. He was the undisputed king once more. He walked slowly toward the back of the hall, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. He entered the private dressing room and stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror. He reached up, tracing the jagged, white ridge of the scar on his cheek. It was cold to the touch. For years, he had told himself he was a shield, the one who took the hits so others could stay clean. But as he looked at his reflection, he didn't see a protector. He saw a man who had watched his own twin break from the safety of a camera lens. He saw a man who had meticulously engineered a trap to send his own blood to a slaughterhouse. The clean brother was gone, but the scarred brother was something far worse. He wasn't just a Mafia boss anymore. He was a ghost who had traded his remaining humanity for a throne of ashes. Seorian picked up a damp cloth and wiped a stray drop of wine from his lapel. His heart fluttered in his chest, a reminder of the medical report and the limited time he had left. He had purged his world of traitors, but the cost was absolute. He had no family left to inherit his name, and no love left to soften his nights. He was a king of shadows, ruling over a kingdom of secrets and silence. He turned off the lights, leaving the ballroom in total darkness. As he walked out into the cold night air, he didn't look back. He had won the war, but as he stared into the blackness of the city he owned, Seorian realized that the monster in the mirror was the only person he had left to talk to. The game was over, and the silence was his only reward.